UFC loves to talk about discipline, structure, and rules. Rules that fighters are expected to follow without question. But what most fans never hear is how often those same rules quietly get bent, twisted, or tossed straight out the window the moment they become inconvenient. Because behind the bright lights and polished press conferences, the UFC has a long history of making bold statements, then doing the exact opposite when power, chaos, or cold hard cash steps into the picture. Today we're diving into 10 moments where the UFC didn't just blur the lines, they erased them completely. Make sure to subscribe to MMA Desk and let's dive right in the video. Dana White once said that women would never fight in the UFC. At the time he sounded dead serious. He even told a story about watching a low-level women's fight where one girl looked like she had barely trained and the other looked like Randy Couture, and he used that to say the whole idea of women's MMA was a mess. That quote spread everywhere. Fans took him at his word. The UFC was a man's sport, and that was supposed to be the end of the discussion. But only a couple months later, things started to change fast.
The Ronda Rousey one didn't really bother me.
Okay, good.
I know what that is. She's a pit bull, man. She's a legend. I mean, I got nothing but love and respect for that lady. What she did was so impressive. She was the first legitimate female superstar. When she said, like, I wasn't an expert.
Ronda Rousey, the UFC bought Strikeforce, and with that deal came one of the biggest game changers in MMA history, Ronda Rousey. Ronda wasn't just winning fights, she was finishing everyone in the first round with violent arm bars, talking trash, and pulling real numbers. Then came her fight with Miesha Tate, which turned into a heated rivalry that grabbed the attention of casual fans, hardcore fans, and every sports show that would put them on. Dana himself admitted that Rousey versus Tate changed how he looked at women's MMA. Suddenly, the thing that was never going to happen became the shiny new feature of the company. The same promotion that said women would never fight in the octagon built entire cards around them, put Rousey on posters, and pushed her as one of the biggest stars in combat sports. So one of the first rules the UFC ever gave the public, that women would never fight there, didn't just break, it exploded, and it made the company a lot of money in the process. For a long time, the UFC tried to act like post-fight chaos was a line you could never cross. If you started a fight after the bell, that was it. Paul Daly is the classic example. After his fight with Josh Koscheck, Daly threw a late sucker punch after the final horn. Dana didn't hesitate for a second. In interviews, he said Daly would never fight in the UFC again, and he kept that promise. This was treated as a clear standard. Anything wild after the fight, you're gone. If you go back even earlier, during the so-called dark ages of the sport, big brawls were called one of the darkest days in MMA.
Is the burnt bridge with my brother unfixable?
I don't hate your brother. You guys need to fight guys your same size. When you fought Floyd, you are massive. He did hit you with a bomb, and you fucking ate it. He's gonna fight Gervonta Davis.
Who do you got?
Gervonta, I think, hits way harder than Floyd, but he's too small. Your brother's gonna be able to get inside on him, put his weight on him, tie him up.
I hear your critique on fighting guys the same size as you. Is that why you guys wouldn't let me fight Conor?
Yeah, you're huge. Conor weighs 145 pounds, 155 pounds.
Yeah, but he says he could beat me.
The UFC was trying to prove to the world that MMA was not just human key fighting, and any out-of-control scene was said to hurt the sport. But then we get to the modern era with huge stars like Conor McGregor and Khabib Nurmagomedov. At UFC 229, after Khabib tapped Conor, he jumped the cage and dove into the crowd to go after Conor's team. A full-on brawl broke out. People were thrown, security rushed in. The governor of Nevada literally left the arena. Dana called it super duper bad and said he was disgusted. But what actually happened from the UFC side? No firing, no lifetime bans. The punishments came from the Athletic Commission, not the company. Conor's trash-throwing dolly incident before UFC 223, where he smashed a bus window, also didn't get him cut. These moments became part of the marketing, part of the story. The rule that post-fight chaos meant your career was over turned into something very simple. It only really applied if you weren't a massive star bringing in huge pay-per-view money. Another rule Dana likes to repeat is that they don't make fights the night of the event. You hear it all the time during press conferences. Reporters ask who's next for the winner, or what's going to happen with the division, and he pushes back with the same line. We don't make fights the night of the fight. It sounds professional, like the company takes time, looks at rankings, and plans things carefully.
Do you think there's ever a chance that Khabib would come back and fight? Khabib, we got 20 million, we got 25 million.
I threw the numbers at him, trust me. Habib has more money than he'll ever spend. He doesn't need to fight again. And I think that he sort of lost the desire when his father passed away. And I think it was a father-son thing that he had with his dad. And also, he's such a good human being that he is truly happy for Islam,
Right.
and what Islam is, and he is fulfilled enough that was his dad's dream, that Habib would reign, then would come Islam, and it's all playing out exactly the way they planned it. I think Habib's in a good place in his life.
But in reality, the UFC breaks this rule over and over. Look at what happened after Jan Blachowicz and Magomed Ankalaev fought to that strange draw for the light heavyweight belt. The result was confusing. Even Jan said he felt like Ankalaev won. Instead of taking time to sort it out, Dana just walked into the press conference and said they were scrapping that plan and doing Glover Teixeira versus Jamahal Hill for the title in Brazil. That was an instant matchmaking move. The same thing happened with the decision to give Colby Covington a title shot against Leon Edwards. Right after a card, Dana was already pushing him as the next guy, even while fans and other fighters questioned it. He has also teased fights in the cage, right after wins, like Israel Adesanya calling out Dricus du Plessis, or Brandon Moreno getting lined up for another big fight almost instantly. These quick decisions feed headlines, keep social media buzzing, and help the UFC control the narrative. So while Dana might say, "We don't make fights tonight," his own history shows that if it makes sense for hype, tickets, or timing, that rule can disappear in seconds. Over the years, Dana has made it clear that certain real-life scandals are supposed to be deal breakers. When accusations of serious domestic incidents or similar behavior surfaced around fighters like Thiago Silva, Michael Graves, or Luis Pena, the UFC cut ties fast. Dana often said that some lines just cannot be crossed, and that once you do, you don't bounce back from it in the UFC.
We offered Francis a deal that would have made him the highest paid heavyweight in the history of the company. More than Lesnar, more than anybody. And he turned the deal down. I think Francis is in a place right now where he doesn't want to take a lot of risk. Feels like he's in a good position where he could fight lesser opponents and make more money. So we're gonna let him do that. We're gonna release him from his contract. We're gonna give up our right to match, and he can go wherever he wants and do whatever he wants.
On paper, that sounds like a strong moral stand. But then the company signed Greg Hardy, a former NFL player with very public accusations in his past, and pushed him on big cards, even giving him co-main event spots. This move confused a lot of fans, because it didn't match the tone the UFC had set before. Then there's the situation involving Dana himself, when video came out of him and his wife slapping each other during a New Year's Eve argument. In most companies, a public scandal like that from the boss would lead to huge pressure to step down, resign, or at least take a long break. In this case, the UFC leadership did not remove him. He spoke about it, said there were no excuses, but his job never changed. The message became blurry. If you are a regular fighter, certain accusations will end your UFC run quickly. If you are valuable enough to the company, or sit at the very top, that no second chances rule starts to look a lot more flexible. It turns from a hard line into more of a case-by-case choice, even if that's not what the public was told at first. For a long time, one of Dana's go-to lines was that he didn't want to make $1 off old legends getting beaten up. He said there was a point where a fighter had given enough, and it wasn't right to keep putting them in danger just to cash in on their name. We saw this when Chuck Liddell started taking hard losses. After losing to Rashad Evans and then to Keith Jardine, Dana was already talking about retirement for Chuck. He said he loved it, cared about his health, and didn't want to keep booking him, even though people would still pay to see him fight. He had similar talks about Matt Hughes and Forrest Griffin, saying they had done enough and didn't need to prove anything else. BJ Penn is another example. After he lost his title to Frankie Edgar, Dana spoke about how great BJ could have been if he had taken training more seriously, and even hinted he should think about stepping away. At that time, it sounded like a rule. Once you reach a certain level of damage and legacy, the UFC will protect you from yourself. But over time, that promise faded. BJ Penn was brought back again and again, long after his prime, even fighting young dangerous strikers like Yair Rodriguez. Anderson Silva fought far into his decline, taking more damage against hungry new contenders. Donald Cowboy Cerrone kept getting booked despite clear signs that his best days were behind him. Suddenly, the retirement pressure that used to come early was rarely seen. Nostalgia fights and old names on cards still sell tickets and views. So the idea that the UFC wouldn't make $1 off past their prime fighters turned into something that sounded nice in interviews, but didn't always match what happened when the matchmakers were building the next card. The UFC used to swear they didn't do freak show fights. Dana would criticize other promotions, especially in Japan, for booking huge mismatches or strange celebrity fights. He even pulled out a list of some of Fedor Emelianenko's opponents to prove his point, mocking pro wrestlers, giant opponents, and odd matchups that looked like stunts more than real contests. He would say that in the UFC, it's the best versus the best, no circus. But then you look at some of the people the UFC signed or brought back. They re-signed Tank Abbott when he was way past his prime, old, and losing more than he was winning. They pushed Kimbo Slice, who was famous not for sporting success but for street fight videos. They brought in Kimbo's old rival, Sean Gannon, whose biggest claim was beating Kimbo in a backyard-style fight. They let James Toney, a legendary boxer with no real MMA skills, fight Randy Couture in a pure-style clash that was basically a showcase. And of course there was CM Punk, a pro wrestler with zero real fight background, getting a UFC contract and a pay-per-view slot off name recognition alone. Brock Lesnar was one of the rare cases where the freak signing actually turned into a real champion. But a lot of these fights looked exactly like the kind of thing the UFC used to laugh at, one-sided matchups created to get attention. So while the UFC talked down other organizations for gimmick matchmaking, they weren't afraid to dip into the same playbook when it helped sell pay-per-views or bring in new audiences from outside the sport. If you listen to Dana talk about cross-promotion, he usually shuts it down hard. He'll say the UFC doesn't co-promote, doesn't share its stage, and doesn't want to risk having its champions lose to fighters from other organizations. He's even snapped at reporters for bringing it up, calling it a dumb question. From that point of view, it makes sense. If you believe your brand is the top of the food chain, you don't want to risk your belt against someone from Bellator 1 or PFL. But that "we don't co-promote" line isn't completely true. Back in the early days, when Pride was the king of MMA in Japan, the UFC actually tried to work with them. They sent Chuck Liddell over to fight in the Pride Grand Prix. They talked about possible matchups between Pride stars and UFC champions. Dana was excited to be associated with Pride because it was good for exposure at the time. Years later, the biggest break of this rule came around a fight that wasn't even MMA. Conor McGregor versus Floyd Mayweather was a full-blown co-promotion, with UFC logos everywhere alongside Showtime Boxing. Conor had his own banner, his own brand, and the UFC shared the spotlight because the money was too big to ignore. Then, when Francis Ngannou left the UFC and set up a boxing match with Tyson Fury, you could see the UFC trying to counter by talking about making John Jones versus Fury in the octagon. Suddenly, the idea of working across sports and promotions didn't seem so impossible. So while the public message is "we don't co-promote," history shows that if the right superstar and the right payday appear, that rule becomes very flexible. Sometimes, Dana gets so mad at a situation that he uses big emotional statements, like "never again." One of the most famous examples is John Jones. Before UFC 200, Jones was supposed to fight Daniel Cormier in a huge rematch. Just days before the event, Jones tested positive for banned substances, and the fight was canceled. It wrecked the card. Dana was furious and said he would never again risk putting Jones in a main event. That sounded like a permanent rule. If you blow up a huge show like that, you lose your headlining privileges. But what actually happened? After serving his suspension, Jones came back and headlined again, multiple times. Even when another test around UFC 232 led to drama and forced the UFC to move an entire card from Nevada to California, Jones still stayed a main event fighter. The same thing happened with Amanda Nunes. She pulled out of her rematch with Valentina Shevchenko on the day of the fight because she was not feeling well, even though the doctor said she was medically cleared. Dana was clearly upset and said he wouldn't headline a card with her again. Yet only a couple months later, she was back at the top of a card, carrying a pay-per-view as champion. These "never again" lines sound strong in the moment and maybe help manage the anger of fans who just lost a big fight. But in the long run, the UFC goes back to what makes business sense. If a fighter is too important, too talented, or too valuable to leave out of main events, that "never again" rule gets quietly dropped. Another rule that seemed strict at first was about media and promotion. The UFC expects its fighters to show up for press conferences, photo shoots, and interviews, especially right before and after big pay-per-view events. When Conor McGregor refused to leave his training camp in Iceland to do the full press tour for UFC 200, Dana pulled him off the card. Conor tried to tweet that he was back on and wanted to just focus on training, but the UFC's message was clear: nobody is above the promotional schedule. Years before, Nick Diaz had his own media issues before a planned fight with Georges St. Pierre. He missed press events, and the UFC punished him by pulling him from the title shot and replacing him. They later rebooked him, but the message was again that you can't skip media and expect no consequences. Then came Ronda Rousey's return at UFC 207. After her brutal loss to Holly Holm, Ronda disappeared from the spotlight. When it was time for her comeback against Amanda Nunes, the UFC and Dana handled her very differently. She did almost no media at all. No big world tour, no long list of interviews, not even a standard pre-fight press conference where she took questions from reporters. The company promoted her heavily, but she herself stayed quiet. Dana said she had done more media than anyone in the past, and that this time, they were giving her what she wanted. So while the rule for most fighters is you must show up and promote your fight or else, Ronda was allowed to skip almost everything because of who she was and what she had done for the company. It showed that even media rules can bend for the right star. One of the most confusing moments where the UFC broke its own rulebook came during the pandemic, when fights were happening in almost empty arenas and you could hear everything. In one event, lightweight fighter Jai Herbert got dropped badly by Francisco Trinaldo. He was clearly hurt, fell back, and looked out of it. Referee Herb Dean hesitated, watching instead of stepping in right away. Trinaldo landed extra shots on a defenseless opponent. On commentary, Dan Hardy couldn't hold back. He shouted, "Stop the fight," and called out Herb from the booth because he felt the fighter's safety was at risk. Afterward, Dana made a very strong statement. He said that if anyone working for him ever approached or confronted a referee or judge, they would be fired and never work here again. He painted it as a hard rule to protect officials from pressure. Not long after, Hardy was gone from UFC broadcasts, and many people linked it to that incident and the tension that followed. But here's where it gets strange. Dana himself has been caught on camera yelling at referees from Cage's side when he thinks a stoppage is late, screaming at them to do their job and stop the fight. Commentators have also questioned refs and judges live on air many times, criticizing calls and saying a fight should have been stopped earlier. The big difference is that Hardy's moment came in a quiet arena, where every word carried, and he became the example. The rule that you can't confront officials seems to have been applied mainly to him, while others, including Dana, have done similar things without the same outcome. It shows how even rules that sound very strict can end up being enforced in ways that look personal instead of consistent. When you look at all these moments together, it becomes clear that the UFC's rulebook isn't really made of stone. It's more like something written in sand, firm one day and washed away the next. The company has strict standards when it wants them, but those standards bend fast when money, power, timing, or superstardom come into play. What starts as a